This week on the Physio Foundations podcast, I'm going to talk again to new grad physiotherapist Brian Kim about his perspectives on some of the career advice that we've been covering so far on the podcast. So on the 17 episodes that we've had so far of Physio Foundations, we've had some amazing tips and advice from some really experienced clinicians about planning and maintaining their careers and their career momentum and how to create opportunities for themselves and for yourself as the listener, and how you can open doors that seem locked, and how to apply foundational knowledge that you learn in university to clinical cases, and how to balance work and life. So I hope you're finding it really useful and you're finding that this is something that you need to know and it can help you develop your career. Lots of really important pieces of advice. But I want to get the perspective of a new grad physiotherapist, because a lot of this content has been aimed at students and new grad physiotherapists, that particular type of the content on the podcast. So I've invited Brian back on to continue the chat that we had on episode 4 of the podcast. So if you want an introduction to Brian, go back and have a listen to episode 4. But for now, Brian, welcome back to Physio Foundations.
G'day, Luke. Thanks for having me again.
It's a pleasure. So how are you going with work and life? We had a chat, well, it was going to be 5 months ago, and then it aired in January. And how have you been going with work and life in general since then?
Look, a lot of it's been much the same. Like, plodding along with clinical work, just learning so much every single day. Like, you feel like sometimes you start to get the hang of things and then poof, something else will come along. And, you got to remind yourself that you're so early on in the career and you're always learning. And that, from what I've heard, doesn't change either the more years you work. So, yeah.
If you're doing it right. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so that's good to hear. So your perspectives and the perspectives of any other new grad practitioner are really valuable here, because if we're interviewing people who are 20, 30 years into their careers and we're giving advice and tips for what they would have done when they were younger, I think it's really valuable to loop back to you and say, what are you doing right now, and what bits of advice and tips for your career and anything we can talk about here, what's the most valuable? And so I've got some snippets from the previous episodes, and I won't play the snippets on the podcast. You can go back and listen to them. I'll just tell listeners where they are and which episodes they're in. And I thought you and I could chat about those. Before we do that though, let's start general. So you're someone who is really actively involved in your own career development, and you're always seeking information, and you're always you're the squeaky wheel that gets the oil, I think. So you're always sort of talking to people about your career, and you're looking for mentoring, looking for different directions you can go in. Is there any career advice that you're really glad so far that you took up?
Oh, plenty. Like, as you said, I think I'm a bit overzealous as well. I want to ask so many people about what's the best path to take. So I'll answer that question by saying there was a bit of advice I got maybe a bit over a year ago before my first job, and I was trying to pick my first job actually, and I had a variety of criteria I was looking at, and a piece of advice I received was that really look at how the workplace markets their mentoring. Some places will be quite clear and say, you have X number of hours each week, you have one-on-one time with a senior clinician, and that's all well and good. But then you have to couple that with your interview experience and see, well, after the interview, did they provide feedback from that? Did they actively get involved in how you are presenting yourself from the get-go? So look for mentoring that is not just on the job description, but also in your interaction when you first meet your, potential workmates or boss too. And yeah, I think that's really helped, because that has led me to a job where there has been a heap of mentoring.
So what does the mentoring look like? Because mentoring can take many different forms, and it doesn't necessarily have to all be formal. What does it look like for you?
That's a really good question. At the beginning, there was quite a lot of one-on-one chats straight after seeing patients or at lunch breaks. As time has progressed and people get busy, we've got other new grad clinicians as well. It becomes a lot of informal texting and calling, just about de-identified clinical cases, and even if it's like a quick email, really it's a mixture of every single mode of communication you could think of. With COVID, it was a little bit difficult to get some of that practical, like mentoring sometimes. But look, even then, that's the clinical side. You have all these different avenues of like contacting a senior clinician. And then another part of mentoring, I think, is, I'm not sure if you were going to touch on this just after, but it's support, right? It's not just clinical support, but it's support for your life outside of work, emotional support when perhaps something in a case is not going your way and it's getting you down. I think, that leads to a lot of burnout for people in the healthcare industry in particular. Like, you empathize with so many people. Some people don't follow the path of recovery that you thought they might. And good mentors will provide you emotional support through that as well and talk through how they've managed similar experiences.
That's a really good point. Your empathy is such an important part of the healthcare you provide and your connection with a person. But then, and it sounds cold when you talk about it like this, but you actually have to have emotional detachment in order to help somebody and to see them from a separate position. And then that's a really nice point that you brought up there about not just mentoring, but support, and not just support for the logistics of your job or what you need to do or knowledge and skills that you need to know and apply, courses you might do, but also that emotional support or training of you as a person as you're developing as well. Lots of avenues for contacting senior clinicians. It's a note I wrote down from what you said there. So you're looking for not just a weekly meeting or where you can formally talk about patients, but that support as well for what you for that interaction with people. That's really good. So, I mean, Susanna talked about this one in episode 16, so a couple of episodes again. So she had two contrasting examples of mentoring and support from each end of the extremes, from when she had a lot of support in one working environment and less support in another one. I'm taking it from listening to you that you've had nothing but good support, and part of that's been how you've chosen your the place you're working, which is good.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I'd say it's been positive experiences for mentoring and support. There have been different experiences. For example, although I do work at a clinic, I also worked at a football club just as the team physio there. And it's a different environment. You don't have a senior clinician there, but mentoring and support doesn't have to come from above. So if you have a hardworking and diligent team of people who are your colleagues, so then that's support as well. Like in a football team, you have the head trainer, you have the other trainers, you have coaches, other board members of the football club. If they're all on the same page, and although they're not a senior clinician, they support you in any other way. You can't make it to a match, you work around and try to find a best fit replacement for that week with everyone else. If it's match day and we don't have a certain supply and we don't know where to get it, if you've got other trainers who are experienced and willing to help out, then that's support too.
It's the same with leadership. Leadership doesn't always have to come from above. In fact, it shouldn't always come from above. It should be coming from below if there's an above and below, if there's a hierarchy to it. The same with mentoring and support. That's another really good point. And so in the episode I mentioned with Susanna, so it's episode 16, it was at 9:25 if you're flicking to that point, Susanna was talking about learning from other practitioners. So watch, learn, listen, ask questions, which is again something that you've talked about actively doing. And you were just mentioning there the support that you get from other practitioners. What about the knowledge and skills, more the physio or the clinician-focused stuff? What have you learnt from other practitioners? It's hard in private practice sometimes to learn directly from someone if you're working one-on-one on your own, especially if you're in a room and you're not in an open setting. It's different at a football club. But what opportunities have you made then to watch and learn and listen from other practitioners?
Um, I guess as time goes on in a career, you need to make your own opportunities sometimes. So it's something as simple as, if I've got 20, 30 minutes spare, then we've got a system in the clinic where you can just ring up the other physio clinic consult rooms. So you might just give a quick call and say, I don't have a patient at the moment. Would you and the patient be comfortable for me to shadow for even just 20 minutes? So you just make your own opportunities. You can go in, you can watch, you can observe. And apart from that, it would be actively in those breaks, or, whether it's lunch or whether it's just after work, popping in, knocking on the door of someone else and saying, hi, I had this. I wasn't sure how to manually handle this situation. And a good mentor will talk through it with you and might even say, all right, hop on the bed. This is how we'll do it. So that's been really great.
Do a demonstration, say, of a technique or an assessment or something that you're asking about, and be hands-on, or it could be more instructional or observational. Mm-hmm. Yeah, none of that'll happen if you don't have the...
Seek it yourself as well.
Yeah, what's the word I'm searching for? Maybe just, I was going to say tenacity, but maybe just the confidence just to go up there and say, well, maybe also a sense of belonging. So you belong there, and one of the reasons you're there is to be mentored and be supported, and you need that, and you're going to go up there and ask for it if you need it. But I know it's hard. Sometimes it's hard to ask for what you need or what you deserve.
Yeah.
But just by saying, hey, I'm available, I need some help.
Sorry, I was going to say, especially as a new grad, I think I have seen other new grads feel that it's hard to ask for help, because when you ask for help, you're admitting you don't know something, right? Which is not a comfortable situation to be in for many people. You kind of have to just get over the pride and ego of, I should know this or should know that. Look, if you don't know it and you've tried to look it up yourself firstly, proactively, then that's what people are for. Like this is what the workplace is for. So get over that hurdle. I struggled a lot with that, like being like, I feel like I should know how to do this. Like university taught me how to do this, but it doesn't click in my head. I mean,
that's a really good point.
Yeah, just ask for help.
And then you're trying to set the limits to where, okay, I should know this. Have I looked it up first? If it's something, you're not going in to ask questions about things that are easy to find in a textbook or that, that you should know. You can pretty quickly, by looking something up, figure out whether you should know this or whether this is something that you need more help to apply or put together. So in that same episode with Susanna and Ebony Rio, so I had Ebony on episode 12 and 13 as well, which were really good, career-focused and also tendinopathy and a little bit of pain-focused content in those episodes. They were great. They both talked about make sure physiotherapy or clinical practice, or you could generalize this to your career in general, make sure physio isn't the only thing that you do, and make sure that you're building skills and interests and ideas outside of what you're doing clinically that you can bring into your clinical work to enrich your practice. And I know that you mentioned this in episode 4 as well, other things that you do, and you mentioned football, you've got music as well. What else do you do that diversifies and helps you in the clinic?
Look, I will say I do a lot of things. I think I kind of have tried to pick up a lot of different hobbies, because I've realized that almost, I don't know if this is too general, almost anything you do outside of work can help in clinic in some way or another. So for example, I still continue the music stuff, playing a band each Sunday. And also, I'm involved in a local theatre company, so kind of just producing shows for them. And yeah, you'd be surprised how many skills are transferable. I don't actively think about, I'm helping, budget this show or helping manage a venue. therefore this will help me with XYZ in my clinical practice. But it's little things like, you get to chat with different stakeholders. You kind of just get more comfortable with communicating with people, setting expectations. You'd be so surprised how like it creeps its way into clinical practice.
You don't have to feel guilty that you're doing something that's not related to your career, especially when you're young. You want to be doing a wide variety of experiences anyway. But it's a good point. I've made the point that don't focus too heavily too early on your career and only do that at the detriment to other things in your life. And the guests have spontaneously brought up that same point as well. That's why I'm coming back to it here. It's a good point to think that this happens unconsciously as well. This is not something you have to necessarily think about. Go and do your things, be interested in life, and there's a lot of skills that are that you develop that will help you with your clinical career. What about foundational knowledge and skills? The question I ask everybody, and I'm not going to ask you it again because you covered that really well in episode 4 when you talked about linking basic science and communication and aspects of clinical reasoning into what you've been doing as a new grad clinician. So in the months since we last chatted, have you found any additional skills or knowledge that's been helping you?
I would say staying on top of evidence-based research is always a tricky part, but it's a foundational skill that is taught at uni as well, right? How to appraise literature, kind of weed out the stuff that's probably not as trustworthy. But to answer your question, I think the foundational skill has actually been, I don't know how to word this, but like placing less of a strict emphasis on research, because a nice quote that I heard, I'm going to have to, I can't quite remember who said it, unfortunately. If we do find it, I'll let you know.
Sure.
But it's, if a single research paper changes your clinical practice, you're probably not reading enough research papers. So I think, there's so many gray areas, and the foundational skill has been being a bit more critical of what I read.
Great.
And
that's a good one, don't you, to add in? Yeah. It's good timing for you. You've been now a practitioner for less than 2 years?
Yeah, less than 2 years.
Yeah. Yep. So in those early days, you come out of university not only with skills to read and appraise literature and knowing what a clinical guideline and a systematic review is, and knowing where to find high quality papers and how to read the methods section, as Ebony was talking about in her episodes, but also, with some fairly up-to-date content knowledge from the literature as well. For example, the diagnostic criteria for osteoarthritis or tendinopathy or any of these topics. Or we need to think beyond musculoskeletal as well. So any diagnostic criteria at all, you could go to a clinical guideline and look at that. You come out of university with those skills and also some up-to-date knowledge. It's what you don't have necessarily is the experience and then understanding the specific patients and their likely how they're going to respond to treatments as well. So the 3 parts of evidence-based practice, you've got the patient's values and then your experience and then the evidence. So you come out strong with the evidence, but then you're trying to build your patient experience and your own personal experience as well, and not to focus too much on limiting yourself to literature, but then keeping your eye on it as well. So that's a good answer, actually. You've come back to appraising the literature as a skill. So how often do you read an article? Or how often do you look things up and say, hang on, I need to look that up. I'm not just going to look at Bruckner and Kahn. I'm going to actually go and do a proper search of the literature and read up on this.
Oh, look, to be frank, probably it's tough to give a ballpark. I think it helps that our clinic has started an initiative where every 3 weeks, I think, we put up a research article together and we kind of discuss it all together as the 10 or so clinicians that we are. So at least every 3 weeks we'll kind of dive deep into one topic.
Like a little journal club.
Yeah. And then apart from that, it really does depend. I think a lot of my a lot of my work does focus on the clinical side, and then it's hard to keep, it's always hard to keep up to date. And then going back to that work-life balance thing, you kind of feel pressured to think, should I, if I don't know 100% what I should be doing all the time, should I be reading articles? Should I be like reading Bruckner and Kahn every night until I do know it? But then you'll burn yourself out as well. So,
you will. Yeah, every night doesn't sound too much fun.
Yeah.
I think it's got to come to you. There's got to be times when you really want to know. You've got a gap there and you think, and I've got a little bit of time. And it's tempting to sit back and just rest there. Can you fill that time in with a little bit of a search of the literature or look in the textbooks? And then it's got to be something that you're passionate about. Back to that episode title from Ebony's episode 12, wasn't it? So having a career that you're passionate about, you're not going to be passionate for your whole career if you're loading yourself up with all these things that you think you should have to do. You have to do every night, reading Bruckner and Kahn. I think I think having a balance there is really important as well.
Yeah.
So in your episode 4, one of your big tips for all clinicians, so particularly for new grade clinicians, was doing a really good subjective assessment or patient interview and considering the whole person. In the months that have passed since we last had a similar chat, are there any other questions that you might ask someone to try to consider the whole person? Anything else beyond just the body chart and beyond the symptoms that they're telling you about that you might consider?
That's a really good question. I think a lot of the extra questions that I've asked over the past months have come to me naturally. So it's hard to put a finger on something in particular. If anything, I think I've placed a lot of focus on people's personality types and how they're motivated. I don't know if that's a question I ask per se in the subjective, but it's something that I try to gauge from the person, because at the end of the day, we're clinicians. We want to educate. We want to treat, whether it is through manual therapy or exercise-based rehabilitation. You need to know how someone's motivated. In a sense, you need to be like a salesman, because you need to know how to connect with the person and know their why. It doesn't matter if you understand all their symptoms and know exactly what's going on if they're not on board. So just, keep the subjective going. I asked a few people, like, look, outside of the reason you're here today, tell me something interesting about yourself. Because it's just a simple rapport building, because as you build rapport, you kind of understand what motivates them as well. That can help you build analogies for education as well. And it can just help you, helps with adherence too.
I'm glad I asked that. I threw that one at you out of the blue just by looking at the timestamps because I've been putting a lot of effort into these timestamps in all the episodes in the show notes. So you can go through and click on, if you find something that you find interesting, you can click on it and go straight to that point. And that was at 6 minutes, 57 seconds into your episode 4. Do a good subjective assessment and consider the whole person was your take home point there. And considering the whole person, where I was going with that question was, anything else that you've thought broadly medically about, you're doing more screening for those seronegative arthropathies, or you're asking more questions about that people's social history. I was thinking more about things that just fit onto the medical notes. And then you've come up with, asking the person to tell them something interesting. Throw something interesting and trying to get to know them, because you want to get to know the person so you can help them and you can connect with them and build that empathy. And that's so important for someone who's really good at their job, but if they've got their head in the books the whole time, they're going to find it hard to connect with the person. And if you don't connect with someone, they're going to go elsewhere.
Absolutely.
So that was a good answer.
I don't know what else to say, to be honest. Like the social history and the past medical red flags. We did talk a bit about that last time, and I wouldn't say anything's changed in that regard. But the rapport building is something that is less formulaic. So I think it's harder to talk about in general.
But making an attempt to build rapport, and however you do that, is important. So it's been quite a broad episode. Rather than talking about specific knowledge and skills and anatomy, physiology. We touched on evidence-based practice, but rather than looking very specifically, we've looked at quite a lot broadly at the new grad experience. So the importance of getting really good advice and looking at how workplaces and employers market their mentoring, and then thinking about your experience of being a new grad clinician and the importance of mentoring and support, and not just support for what you do, but also your emotional support and your support for your development as a person, and talking about how that support doesn't necessarily have to come from above. It can come from beneath. It can come from even from your patients, but also from your practitioners and peers that you work with. And then you talked about the importance of evidence-based practice and praising the literature and having a bit of a journal club at work. Let's leave it there. All right, Brian, thanks very much for the chat. And listeners, please find the share button and like and share and distribute this episode with a friend so we can get these episodes out to other people that will find them interesting. And make sure you tag Susanna and I in @Periton Physio. In episode 4, Brian's given us a bit of a summary of his where you can contact him and you can find him. So you can look that up in episode 4, and you can find links to all the podcast players and all the different podcast players in our website, which is periton.physio. And thanks very much, Brian, for coming on for a chat. Appreciate it.
No worries. Thank you.
So until next time, this is Brian and Luke wishing you all the very best with your studying, professional development, and lifelong learning.